Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the sixth in our series on ushering in the ecological revolution of our Naturenomics dialogue series, which has been on for a week. In some of our previous sessions till now, we've explored the need for integrating communities and ecology with economic planning for a Naturenomics-based recovery plan, tapping the inherent resiliency and stability of rural and local economies for generating green jobs, which are becoming more important now than ever. The urgent need for providing ownership and management rights of our forests to our communities, especially women. Today, we're going to be taking off from that session and really take a look at how we define and measure growth and prosperity in this new age and this turning point that we're all in. Most measures till now have failed to integrate environmental components, but COVID-19's intersection with deforestation, wildlife, ecological health has really highlighted how intimate all of these connections actually are and how urgently we need to redesign our concept of well-being and our concept of growth. Our esteemed panelists for this evening, Dr. Khosla, Sarla Kaling, Saurav Roy, and Shankar Venkateshwaran will share their thoughts on how we can do this. I thank all the attendees for joining and showing your interest for this session. We'll be accepting a total of about 5 questions for the panelists, and we request you to put all your questions in the Q&A box that you see down under your screen on Zoom. If you're one of the 23,000 people that this is streaming to through Facebook, please drop questions in the comments section. Today's panel will be moderated by Dr. Ashok Khosla. Dr. Khosla has been chairman of the Development Alternatives Group since 1982. DA is the world's first social enterprise dedicated to sustainable development. Through DA and its commercial affiliate Tara, they create sustainable, scalable consumption and production solutions in rural India. Dr. Khosla has served as director of the Indian government's first Environment Office, director of Infoterra in UNEP, co-chair of the UN's International Resource Panel, president of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and also president of the Club of Rome. He also served as a member of India's Scientific Advisory Council to the Cabinet and has received multiple accolades from the British government, the UAE, and the UN, and has held various faculty positions at Harvard. For now, over to you, Dr. Khosla, to take the session forward.
Thank you, so much. Very nice of you. I hope that some of the people are already online, and I would like to start by introducing you to the 3 co-panelists that we have here. The first is Sarla Kaling. She's the Regional Director of ATRE's Regional Office for the Eastern Himalaya, Northeast India region. Her main work is on managing projects, research, design, analysis, fundraising, networking. In other words, she's the boss and she has to bring everything in and make sure it goes out. She has more than 15 years of experience of working in the field of ecology, especially the relationship with people and biodiversity in the Himalayas. Before she joined ATRE, she worked with WWF and for the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund in the Eastern Himalayan Biodiversity Hotspot Program. We also have my old friend Shankar Venkateshwaran, who is a part of the founding team of EQ, Investment Advisors, that is setting up a fund to invest in publicly listed companies to make sure that they behave properly, especially on sustainability and ESG issues. He was chief of Tata Sustainability Group at Tata Sons Limited, where he guided the whole group on sustainability and corporate responsibility initiatives. He worked in PricewaterhouseCoopers before that as Director of Sustainability. And before that, he has 15 years in social development work with various international NGOs, including ActionAid and the American India Foundation. He has helped draft the national guidelines for responsible business conduct, and they've been released about a year ago, and he's now assisting the government in trying to make sure they get implemented properly. Saurav Roy leads the corporate social responsibility efforts of Tata Steel, which spans sustainability and corporate finance and merger and acquisitions across a range of sectors like metals and mining, power, logistics, infrastructure, and hospitality. In his last engagement, Saurav anchored the sustainability strategy work of Tata Sustainability Group, TSG, and worked with Tata companies to integrate social and environmental aspects in their approaches to business. He's also worked with the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and several other organizations in the Indian development sector before he joined the Tata Group. And he has a deep interest in both sustainability and development finance. So we have these three people, and I am supposed to make sure that we have a good conversation over the next hour on the issues that have been identified for this session, which are broadly speaking interdependence of various kinds, which I will try and give you a little bit of a glimpse into, and the relationship between sustainability and cultural issues, the value systems that we have from various kinds of cultures, with the specific purpose of looking at whether indigenous cultures on the one hand and business cultures on the other have anything to offer in terms of more sustainable practices. I myself believe that most cultures, indigenous or reasonably pre-modern, except maybe for the last 300 or 400 years, have in them the value systems of being a one world, a one entity of life on this planet. In ancient Vedic times, we used to call it Vasudeva Katambakam. But you know, all the way, I've never been in a culture, including in East Africa, in South Africa, they have terms like Ubuntu in Bantu, in South Africa. They have terms like Umoja in Swahili. They have terms almost in every native American Indian language that basically says the same thing, that we are all one, and we are not just a cooperative species, but we are much more than that, a mutually supportive species. So this goes back very deeply into human culture. I think since the Industrial Revolution, maybe a little bit before that, and I suppose the seeds of it were, if you'll pardon the pun, sown in the Agricultural Revolution, that we sort of became a little bit alienated from the land and from each other. In ecological science, we have a number of insights on this interdependence. There is, of course, the well-known interdependence between the 5 kingdoms of nature. The waste of one kingdom always becomes the food of another kingdom. Otherwise, you would be buried in waste. Nature has no waste because of the intricate mechanisms it's designed through the 5 kingdoms to take care of what we now call the circular economy. There is also, of course, the kinds of interdependence between species that we call mutualism. For example, a bird feeding off an alligator's teeth, or commensalism, for example, orchids living on a tree, or even parasitism, like mosquitoes and human beings. These are different kinds of relationships and relationships which often are positive, but not necessarily always. In social systems, it seems to me that we really now have to look at the kinds of interdependence in different economic strata, in different social segments, between governments and communities. So there's going to be quite a lot of work for us in the next 50 minutes. And I'm now going to stop talking and suggest that one of the panelists take up a question that I'm going to ask them, and then the others see whether they can do a little bit better. The first question I think I would like to ask them is, how can ecological indicators be better integrated with social development and GDP measures to create a more holistic understanding of well-being, human well-being, and natural resilience and productivity. Can any of you, one of you, choose to give us your views on that? Would Shankar, would you like to try your hand at that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ashok. I can give it a shot. I think, what is certainly problematic as an indicator is GDP. And sadly, that's the most universal one. Because GDP certainly doesn't seem to measure, and I think Robert Kennedy, way back in the 60s, I think it was at the University of Kansas, made a very interesting speech on what it doesn't measure and what it seems to measure, which are almost perverse. And I think he ended by saying that it seems to measure everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. I think that was his quote.
Very much.
And I think it's so profound, Ashok, so long ago, right? And I think we are struggling with that, and we are struggling even in this country with that, with looking at GDP as a measure. 5 trillion economy gets thrown around just every now and then. And I think what that does create is that it seems to create a sort of, when you're running after a measure like that, it seems to not take into consideration what the costs are of reaching that particular measure.
Right.
And so that's, I think, the big challenge. GDP does have something which is very attractive, which is why it is used so widely. I mean, it is relatable, it is comparable. So these are all important elements of an indicator. You can compare it across countries, across time, across geographies, across different such dimensions. But sadly, it doesn't measure what we wanted to measure. Now, attempts, of course, have been made to try and broaden the idea of measuring development. So we've had the Human Development Index, for example, for a long time, which looks at life expectancy, education, living standards. And that's evolved into something called the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. But what happens with all these indices is a lot of them are still focusing on the social dimension or the human dimension, which is, I think, very important, which GDP certainly doesn't. But I don't know whether there's enough work and thinking being done which incorporates the natural dimension, the nature's dimension into measuring development. And to me, that's the big challenge that we're all faced with. So I'll stop there because I really don't know what the answer is, but clearly that is the gap that we need to seek. And I certainly would like to hear from both Sarla and you about how that gap gets filled, or what are the kinds of indicators that we are sort of thinking about for that.
Thank you. Saurav, would you like to add something to that? Is Saurav on the line?
I think he was there briefly, but I don't see him there.
Saurav, you're on mute. Can we unmute Saurav? Okay. So let me start with Sarla, and then we come back to Saurav. Sarla, do you have some insights that you'd like to share with us?
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure being on this webinar. And I think I'm also very happy because this is a culmination of some discussions that we've been having with Balipara Foundation as part of the Eastern Himalaya coalition that we are trying to come up with. And one of the things that we've always been discussing is, how do we bring ecological indicators and environmental indicators in the mainstream of measuring growth? And I think it's again, like my previous speaker, Shankar has already said, this is a challenge and we do not have the answers to this. But what I can say is there has been so much of work on the ecological sides that could be, there are so many frameworks that are already existing. If you look at the ecosystem services framework, which really links very well into, helping us to develop these indicators, there is this socio-ecological landscape ecosystem-based management approaches. There are several approaches, there are several framework, and there's so much of scientific work already done there. There's so much of knowledge, there's so much, but I don't understand why we have not been able to, mainstream ecological and environmental indicators into any of these growth indicators. While it's so obvious for us, and I think these have been discussed and these have been issues of discourses, I just don't understand why we have not been able to, put it into this, put it into the overall growth indicator. So to me, actually, when you ask this question, I'm a little bewildered, because I think it's so, for us as natural scientists, we think it's there. It's so obvious. There's the connectivity, the linkages, and COVID-19 even makes it even more clear to us that in the ways ahead we have to have, but I don't know why, it's been such a big challenge for us to do that.
You're quite right, Sarla. Now, let me, since we don't have Saurabh yet, maybe I can just say a couple of words on both of you. We've done a huge amount of work on trying to quantify, as you say, the ecosystem services, biodiversity related indicators, which can either be measured just as well as a lot of parameters in GDP, maybe better. And in the case of TEEB, the big study that was carried out by UNEP and IUCN and others, TEEB has shown that it's eminently possible to amplify the GDP indicators with, or complement them with much better insight into the costs. The costs especially, because normally we assume that the costs to nature are zero. But I would like also to say to Shankar that actually the more interesting things are the benefits that you've ignored in counting your GDP. There are many things, of course, economic parameters for 70 years since Kuznets invented the term GDP have been worked over, so everybody knows how to do that. But a lot of the social benefits, and certainly many of the natural environmental sort of natural capital benefits, are forgotten. So both from the point of view of costs and from the point of view of unquantified or unregistered, unrecognized benefits, the GDP parameter really is a misleading parameter. You can't throw it away because most of the world is run on it. And indeed, you shouldn't throw it away because the economic ones do matter. It's not that they're completely useless, but they are not very good at designing future investments and decisions without the other ones. So, Sarla, the only answer I can give you is that the world is run by economists, and economists don't see anything but money. There's just no way they can recognize that there is anything other than dollars, and it's usually just dollars, So I don't know, what else can one say?
Yeah. But I also think, some of the benefits of nature, like, there are so many of these intangible benefits that we talk about, like spiritual or aesthetic, or just this, which people are talking about even now, even more now in the COVID situation, about, how nature gives you, de-stresses you, gives you that mental, peace and all that. I think some of these things are so intangible.
Of course.
Yes, and I think it's so difficult to measure these kind of, how do you represent them? How do you, even measure them? Some of these are also a challenge, I guess.
They're a challenge, but then there are lots of things we make assumptions about in the economy, which would have been a challenge if you were as rigorous as they expect you to be. Let me come back to you, Sarla, about what your insights, having worked in the Northeast and in the Eastern Himalayas with many tribal populations, people, what are the indigenous perspectives on the issues between economic, ecological, and human interactions of this type? Do they have answers that we could feed into the system for designing a better parameter?
I think for the tribal or the indigenous communities, a lot of, the cultural aspects of nature, the spiritual aspects of nature, and also the social institutions and traditions that they form and they're able to carry on with. I think that matters a lot to them. They value that a lot, their own, indigenous value systems, their traditions. And also, if you look at them, I think they also live in a landscape which is a socio-ecological landscape, because you're not far away from nature. So, relationship is there. But again, I must again say that, again, in the world that we are in and the changes that are happening, we cannot, again, romanticize these, things, because things are really changing fast, for example. So even in the Northeast, even in areas where there were pristine habitats and all that. So a lot of, should I say, developmental projects are there. There's so much of infrastructure development. And there's the huge issue of aspirations of the people, the younger generations. So I don't know, in a way, there are those value systems which used to be there. But it's again a very big question. Are they, are they eroding? Are they changing? Again, culture is something which is so dynamic. But I guess there are some systems, there are certain things we can still take from them, because there is still that closeness with nature. But at the same time, I have to say it's changing a lot, because, because of economic development and the aspiration to be, grow and be rich and earn money, so as to put it in simple words. So that again, causes a little bit of, erosion in some of the value systems that we can see. And I mean, for all of us to see and read, and we've also heard a lot about what's going on in the Northeast in terms of the nature, what is happening to nature or the environment and all that. So,
yeah, well, this is a major problem. With all its shortcomings, and God knows there are shortcomings, the American way of life is seductive. I mean, you watch it on television, yes, and every young person wants a bit of it. Why not me too?
Yeah.
And you see that even in a place like Bhutan, which has really got its society so well centered, and its value system so well centered. But when young people are going to be bombarded with the kinds of goodies that other people have in the world, they're seductive. You lose track very quickly. So
Ashok, just a couple of, if I may, just a couple of experiences on this, if I may share. I'm not no expert on this, but I was just struck, in fact, that a couple of months ago, in fact, Saurabh Roy is not here, but Tata Steel does a annual sort of a gathering of indigenous communities every year for about 2-3 days, and I had gone there and I was to speak to some of them on climate change. And I have to say, I was so struck by the fact that I have so little to tell them, because they can tell us so much more about climate change than we could ever tell them. All the stuff that we keep talking amongst ourselves about preserving forests. We have one of our NDCs is about creating carbon sinks through forestation. Indigenous communities are doing that, and they get no rewards for that, actually. And whereas, so in many ways, their pains are subsidizing our luxuries.
Exactly.
So I think that somewhere, we need to find a way to enable them to also live what you're saying, the seductive American way of maybe some incomes, but by doing things what they normally do, which is conserving, which is using, in a frugal way, and all that, because that adds to what our own national commitments definitely are. So I'm wondering how does one make this happen so that what they do is something which benefits all of us. They get rewarded for that. And that's something that's always a very striking thing for me.
You're absolutely right. Of course, there's a lot of talk about carbon offsets, about biodiversity offsets and ways to reward people, but it hasn't ever taken off, and the chances are it'll get hijacked long before it hits the ground. Somebody will have captured it, and that will be the end of it. But Shankar, since Saurabh is not online, maybe you can help with a little bit of your background with business. How can business help bring about, or at least not upset, the current types of range of good value systems that you both have just described. So the question is, in our desperate need to increase GDP, in order to increase consumerism and production of goods that are either non-essential or whatever, business is locked in to some extent in promoting the kind of value systems that we now find are inimical to the future of the planet and of our communities. So what are we going to do with that? How is business going to play a good citizen role?
I think that's an important sort of consideration, because states can't do it by themselves. People need to get involved, and of course, business needs to get involved. And I think in some senses, goes back to the social contract that business has with society of producing goods and services, but at what cost? And clearly, regulations are supposed to play that role, but sometimes they don't, and especially as businesses become bigger and bigger and more powerful, they have a greater influence on regulation to their own benefit. So that happens to be the million-dollar question. But I think the good news is that things are changing, and I think, and let me just tell you the way I'm seeing these changes. So one is that I think the set of drivers that actually push business behavior are actually increasingly widening. Traditionally, there were three drivers that business used to take very seriously. One is, of course, regulations, because you have to follow the law. The second is signals that you would get from investors. The people who have invested in your business, or who are providing you loans to buy equipments that you require for your business. So obviously, they are taken very seriously. And third, of course, is customers. These were the traditional stakeholders that businesses would take very seriously. Now, fortunately, the good news is that all these three are changing in terms of their expectations of business. Regulations are getting tighter and stronger, partly because of all our international commitments that we are signing on to, like the SDGs, like the Paris Agreement, which is then obviously forcing regulations to make those things happen. Investors, and this is very interesting, and since I sort of work with a startup that's looking at investments as a way to make this happen, investors are actually recognizing that their investments, and this is very interesting, because I remember one very veteran investor once telling me that there are two emotions that guide an investor. One is greed, and the other is fear. And fear really plays a big role in this, because I think what happens is investors are beginning to realize that companies that do not society or the environment are actually at risk, and so their own investments are at risk. So more and more investors are actually pushing companies into more responsible behavior. And just to give you a sense, estimates are anywhere from $20 to $25 trillion in investments, that is of investor money, goes into companies that actually are operating responsibly. So investors are pushing this agenda, not out of any goodness of heart necessarily, but just out of this fear and greed set of emotions. Yeah, self-interest, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, third, customers are also behaving differently, not so much in this country, Ashok, yeah. And I think to me that's the big challenge, that how do we as customers make those choices of what products to buy, I personally, for example, haven't touched a cola, an aerated drink, for the last 15 years because I believe that they unsustainably use water. But I wish they were, just imagine if all of us started behaving that way, these kinds of changes would happen. So I think the drivers are there. The stakeholders are getting more and more, the same stakeholders are asking different questions. New stakeholders like communities and employees are becoming more vocal. And that's pushing companies into behaving in a slightly different way. So for example, triple bottom line thinking. So thinking not just of your financial bottom line, but also how are you impacting society and the environment. Looking at SDGs and making that a part of your core business framework. UN principles, guiding principles on business and human rights. Something that our own country has, the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct. Now, all these are frameworks that are getting created, and companies are therefore getting more and more urged into behaving in a responsible manner. So I think the stakeholders are closing in, and there are responses from the system that are helping companies to start getting more and more responsible about this. And I wouldn't say that it is sort of widespread, but I think the trend is very clear. And what is also interesting, and this ties into the last question that you asked, and I'll stop there after that, is there are also methodologies that are being created how to measure, how to value a business's impact on nature and on the society. So you have something called the Natural Capital Protocol, for example, which in a sense is based on the team framework that you mentioned earlier. But this is a global movement of companies, academia, NGOs who've come together and created a protocol that helps companies put a value to their costs and benefits of how they impact the system or the natural systems. And so the dream is, as you start putting a value, a rupee value or a dollar value, as you said earlier, to this, then your profit and loss account doesn't just become a financial profit and loss account, it becomes a total profit and loss account. And I think that's the sort of holy grail that we need to move to. So we are moving there, moving very slowly, but I think the movement is certainly visible. So I'll stop there.
Yes, I think X number of years down the road, 10, 15, 20, things will be a lot better. But there is one flaw, one barrier to change, which is the present construction of professional management, which is not in its interest. That is the major factor preventing real change, because the investor has a long-term view. The money is tied up. They're going to be looking at not just the next quarter, not just next financial year, but for some time. The workers, the partners, the vendors all have a certain amount of stake in it. But the driver of decisions, day-to-day decisions, is driven by the next quarter and the earnings reports that are going to come up, and by the share price of his company, etc. Now, all of that tends to not force them, but enable them to take short-term decisions, which are inimical to what you're saying. So we've got maybe to do a little bit of reconfiguring the corporate structure in such a way that these outrageous bonuses that you get either in the banks or in manufacturing companies or in the energy companies, huge bonuses for immediate sudden windfall gains, that is a driving force that's pretty hard to beat. And so a lot of our problems have arisen because of that part of it. Now, if that were to be taken care of, I think a lot of what you're saying could happen much faster. Sarla, do you have much to do with businesses as well? Can you?
The only comment that I had, and it made a lot of sense with what Shankar was saying, is especially in the Himalayas, we deal with the tourism sector. And tourism, which is so much, dependent on nature or the aesthetic value of nature or the cultural value of nature. But tourism itself sometimes has become a bane for the mountains. The kind of tourism we have promoted, the growth that we have promoted in tourism basically is, it's very detrimental to nature. And it's, a lot of, for states like Sikkim or Darjeeling or even Arunachal Pradesh for that matter, and the Northeast where tourism is not so much, it's not there. They are looking forward to tourism as being one of the pillars of growth. So also like Sikkim and Darjeeling, they say that tourism is their pillar of growth, but the kind of demand for tourism that you have over here, the customers and their demand of tourism is completely, opposite, diametrically opposite to the culture of the place. For example, we are trying to work on the food systems, but the kind of customers you get to come here, customers from any part of India would like to come here and again promote a different kind of a food system. And all the business over here caters to that kind of a food system instead of, demand for the local food system, which is much more sustainable for that place, which has less carbon footprint. How do we change this kind of, the behavior of customers' demand? So we have a small project initiative which is going on, trying to say how can we, build a customer system or a demand system which actually focuses on local things, local products, local food, So homestays is one of them, but the entire thing, like food to culture to everything else,
music.
So that which doesn't prove detrimental to the culture or to the nature of the place, because the mountains being a very big tourism industry focus kind of.
Yes, you're right. This is a major issue, and it's in some ways got built-in contradictions which are going to have to be dealt with by very imaginative things. You see, Indian domestic tourism is about going, seeing places, but carrying your culture and your food and your clothing with you. I mean, you don't go to another place to test their food. You don't go to another place to learn about how they dress and what they sing or what they do. You go there to observe, and you got to take your cook and your utensils with you. So this is a problem that we've been facing, because I work a lot on ecotourism, both in the plains and in the hills. And for example, in Bundelkhand, which is a wonderful area with tremendous, heritage of all kinds of things, music, food, culture, stories, and everything. And the people who come there cannot possibly be gaining much. They're just away from home, that's all. So we've got to figure out what happens. Now, we're getting close to the end. We've got another 10 minutes or so. What I thought it would be very nice is if you were in charge, if you had, you were the advisors rather than the economists who are running our country. If you were able to say, these are the 3, 4, 5 things, and I don't want to put a number on them because they could be dozen, silver bullets, if you like, but it's not a one silver bullet, it's a whole bunch of possible interventions that you would like to see that would enable not so much the GDP being measured right, not so much the question of this interdependence being right, but the outcomes, overall outcomes, such that we have a more resilient, more prosperous, more human-based and life-based future for this country. How would you go about doing that? Would you like to try it, Shankar? Or did you just disappear on purpose?
No, I'm no, I'm having bandwidth so I thought I should put my video off so that I don't completely get cut off. Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to give it a shot, an answer to that question, Ashok. In fact, that's one of the things I've been doing for the last 7-8 years, working with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs on trying to, build frameworks and reporting frameworks for responsible business conduct. So I mentioned the National Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct. I had the good fortune to be one of 2 people who were charged with drafting that, and that was released last year. We're just in the process of creating a reporting framework on this, which has been approved now by the government, and is going to be released. And the top 1,000 companies are going to be mandated. The top 1,000 listed companies will be mandated to report not just on the financial, but on a whole lot of non-financial parameters which are relating to nature and to society. So I think that's a very good move from the government. It's actually quite forward-looking. In fact, very few governments actually, and certainly none in the emerging economies, have actually done this with any degree of seriousness. So I think nudging companies to to sort of understanding what responsible business means and to be more transparent about it is, I think, a very important element, because more data that is outside in the public domain on what companies are doing, it allows more stakeholders to then analyze those performances and do something about it. So civil society, consumer movements, and so on can use that data. So I think that's a very important element that that as policymakers that one could do. The second one, and this is something that again many of us have been pushing the government to do this more systematically, is that the government, I think, is the single largest procurer of goods and services in this country. Almost 25% of all goods and services are actually purchased by the government. Now, the government typically does its purchases on what they call the basis of L1, the lowest quotation. What we have been trying to urge government to do is to also factor in responsible business conduct into their purchase decisions. How do you make public procurement? How do you push and favor companies that actually exhibit responsible business in government procurements that happen, so that then there's a business reason for you to become more responsible in the way you conduct yourself. So that is the second sort of prescription that we've been trying to work on. And third, which feeds into this, is trying to create an index that actually can measure a company's performance on being responsible. So if you create an index, or if the government creates an index, because any private person or entity creates an index, it may not be taken seriously. But if government creates an index using the national guidelines as the basis to create this index, then you can actually put companies in a sort of pecking order, and so that decisions on whether a state should allow, which kind of companies should a state allow in tourism, to Sarla's point, would be determined by how that company scores in terms of its responsible business conduct. So it could be things like that. So I think these are the kinds of things that I think, at least for a business, or to make sure that businesses start taking this more seriously, and that there is a return for them when they take it seriously, is something that I would think are very good steps to take this forward.
And those are terrific steps. Sarla, would you like to start wrapping up with yours?
Yes, Dr. Khosla. So I think, so just even going through, I don't know, for these things, whether, we have a best practice kind of model that we can look at. There's Bhutan, but, with these, this perception of, but is it, how do we come up with indicators? I'm talking from an indicator point of view. But even looking at the GNH kind of an index, can we come up with some, measurable indicators about, that's the closest country that we can probably explore to look at, how are they looking at these as a best practice measure. So that is one. The other entry point I see right now, and we've been working in this there's a huge program, the National Biodiversity Mission program, of which one component that we are working with is the bioeconomy, biodiversity and bioeconomy program. So probably bioeconomy is also one of the entry points that I could think of, which could showcase, demonstrate, because I guess a lot of this is like, proof of concept, showcasing, demonstrating before we, actually it comes into full practice and mainstream. But some of the documents that I've read, even in the bioeconomy, documents and research papers, especially those that have been published here, or very few of them in India, they still have like indicators which are kind of conventional. It still talks about, again, how much, the quantity produced, how much money earned, income. So again, slightly, again, not mainstreaming, although it is a nature-based kind of an industry. So those are two things. And yeah, I think those are two things I would explore and look at bioeconomy as an entry point.
Thank you. Those are very interesting inputs. The idea behind this has been around some time. In fact, Valipara Foundation has been talking about Naturenomics for more than a decade. And, they've been looking at these kinds of issues. You have in A3, a lot of us in IUCN have been in that business for a long time. We do need to encourage people to keep hacking away at this because it's fundamentally important, and yet it doesn't fit into normal political or political economic decision making. So we have no choice but to keep hammering away. I really do want to thank the organizers of the meeting. They've put together a terrific set of interventions. I'm sorry that we lost Mr. Malhotra on the way, but frankly, this was a great conversation, and I appreciate the two panelists being so cooperative and insightful, being able to give us things that we hadn't really thought much before. Saurav, you are going to take over the responsibility of answering the questions being raised from the participants.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Khosla, Sarala, Shankar. I apologize on Saurav Roy's behalf. He sent me a text saying that he was caught off guard in a rainstorm just outside of Jamshedpur and wasn't able to make it. We have quite a few questions. I don't think we can go through all of them, but I'm going to pick some of the most relevant ones for this discussion and begin shooting them. And most of those are open-ended and could be answered by anyone. So I leave that call to you, Dr. Khosla. One question is, many times large infrastructure or development projects are clear despite numerous evidence, including cost-benefit analyses and environmental and social impact assessments that highlight that the negatives largely outweigh any positives. This is after making the business case that the project doesn't make sense from a sustainability point of view. How does one reconcile the building of a coastal road project in Mumbai or a large thermal power plant in a biodiversity hotspot? How can we use the existing empirical evidence to actually influence decision-making in light of changes like dilution of existing environmental impact assessments?
So it's obviously aimed at Shankar, but I would like to have a few words after that. Shankar, would you like to start?
No, Ashok, why don't you go first? I think you're far more qualified than I to speak.
Not really, but I did start the Office of Environment in the Government of India in 1971, and Mrs. Indira Gandhi threw 3 or 4 big projects at me. I was 31 years old. I didn't have any idea on what I could do with these. I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the staff. But there were things like a huge fertilizer plant being funded by the World Bank in New Bombay. There was the Mathura refinery in Mathura near the Taj. And there were big projects. There was an amazing project that the Indian Navy wanted to do in Chilka Lake for a naval base, which was amazing given the fact that this is one of the most precious biomes in the world, let alone in the country. So I've been through a very tough time learning what it is that impact assessment and making the trade-offs and decisions in this field imply. And all I can say is that these are difficult decisions. You do have to have, in a poor country like ours, a certain amount of economic activity that is going to be hurtful. And you have to make very, very strong decisions one way or the other. But there are certain irreversible costs that you cannot afford to compromise. The fact of the matter is that there are values, particularly species, particularly water systems. There are all kinds of things that we are now paying a huge cost of for having neglected them in the past. So all I can say is that in the case of a coastal road, which does not have a business value, the only thing all one can say is that the vested interests which are promoting that road are very powerful, and only a people's movement is going to be able to deal with them, because they own the government. There's virtually no way that you're going to be able to deal with it. So it has to be a matter of the kind of protests that you're now seeing, for example, in the US, for other reasons. But the point is that governments are not in a position to make rational decisions if they do not have the strength of the voters behind them. And if they don't see that, and they have the strength of the business people who finance them, you're going to get an answer that's wrong. So I believe that you cannot leave this to the most well-intentioned bureaucrat who wants to do everything right for the environment when the pressures are so high from above. I remember in the case of the Chilka Lake, the admiral, who was a very famous person in India, never forgave me for my decision. I mean, I got into a lot of trouble, but that was the end. I mean, you have to do what you have to do. But I would say that you cannot just hope that pure rational calculation, analysis of what are the benefits and costs is going to get you the right answer unless you also deal with the political economy of the issue. Now, Shankar.
If I can just add to that, I completely agree with Ashok. I think it has to be a people's movement. The only thing I would add, and I'm shut my video off because I'm having bandwidth problems. The only thing I would add is I think there is a case also to not just address the political economy issue, but also address companies that want to actually then build these infrastructure. Because I think that's the piece that we don't do enough of. The company in this case is a very well-known one, very famous one, but I don't think there's any protests really about how the company is behaving, or are there any ways to go to the board of directors and say, look, you're a responsible company. Is this what you want to do? So I think there are lots of elements that we should start doing, because this is how movements overseas, as Ashok was saying, actually got built. I mean, if you go back to sweatshop labor, at the end of the day, the sweatshop labor issue got in a sense addressed only because students in universities started boycotting products that were made from sweatshop labor. So you want to not only address the political economy, absolutely must do that, but also try and address companies that you think are not behaving responsibly.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Yeah, well, even, I mean, there have been instances where there has been a lot of empirical data, because the question is also asking, can we use the empirical data available to, in the question? But there are cases that we know of where there has been empirical data, lots of work, ecological work, biodiversity work, and yet it has never stopped, and there are many examples in the Northeast, in other parts of the country, and also people's movement. If you look at some of the, longest people's movement, like the Terry Dam and all that. So many times, even these things,
Yes, you're right.
It hasn't stopped them.
Yeah.
But I think in many cases, probably in not such huge projects, probably in some other projects, maybe we as academicians or as, civil society have even failed in our role of also saying, providing some alternatives, probably, saying that, okay, if this doesn't work, this is the way it could work.
Yeah, of course.
So, the right questions and asking the right questions also are saying that, these are some of the ABCD. If you don't do this, then you could do this kind of thing. Sometimes we have not even been able to probably provide those kind of information.
Very good point. Saurav, would you like another? I think we have time for one more question, or one or two.
Yes. I think we can manage two in. I think Saurav Roy just managed to connect in. Saurav, if you're there, please say hi, and we'd be happy to have some words from you.
Yeah. Is it raining a lot?
Okay. He just logged off again. So I'm just going to move off, and I think that this question is quite linked to the comments that were just made about, I think, changing people's perceptions and also understanding people's perceptions. So this is about the Gross National Happiness Index, and says that the GNH index measures focus on perceived human ecological relations, but no objective measures of ecological health and human welfare or vulnerability in relation to ecological health. How do we envision an index that fixes this disconnect?
Well, I would,
Dr. Costa would be.
no, maybe Sarla, would you like to say anything on that?
I think I don't think I would be able to answer as such,
Okay.
because, you know.
And Shankar, you said you have views on GNH?
No, I may have a view. I certainly have a view on it that I think it's a good thing, but beyond that, I'm afraid of Ashok, I have no wisdom to offer.
I've spent some time in Bhutan and at the GNH Center, and we do a lot of work here. I'm not sure that what the questioner is saying is absolutely correct. It is true that you may not have an objective measure of the order of how many tons of wheat you exported this month. You may not have that level of precision, but more and more every month, the Bhutanese GNH Center is getting closer and closer to measures that make good logical sense and adequate comparability with other measures, so that you can decide whether this combination is better than that combination. So it's not really without a fair amount of science behind it. You know, there's 9 major categories. There's around 90 odd subcategories. They've done a huge amount of work, and they're not the only ones. Brazil has this.
Yes.
Brazil its politics is in a mess right now, but they've done a lot of work. There's a fair amount of work in the Scandinavian countries. There are a lot of places where they've done excellent work, but Bhutan certainly has given its heart and soul to this measure. And I would say that if a country were to adopt the present state of progress on defining GNH, it would be at least as well off, if not better off, than using pure GDP. I mean, it's a very solid piece of science. It's very good science. It uses human psychology a great deal, of course. It uses sociological factors, and it has a mix of parameters that satisfy a very wide variety of value systems. And above all, it gives a great deal of emphasis to a balanced life in which you have good balance between work and life, but where you have the ability to design what your own future is. And I think it's a tremendous piece of work. And I'm a great admirer of it. I don't believe you can put numbers 1 to 10 on every one of those parameters, but you're getting closer and closer to it. And I would say it's as good for me as GDP.
May I make a comment over there? Yeah, I also think, like, you know, our own perception of indicators, it's, you know, the way we've been taught and educated and trained. So it's a lot is about numbers,
Exactly,
about quantitative thing. And we kind of undermine some of these, you know, qualitative indicators or qualitative things, and kind of say that, you know, you can't measure it. It doesn't have any unit or metric. So it's, you know, it's not a very good measurement. So I think we need to also rethink about the way we define indicators.
Shankar's quote from Bobby Kennedy says it all. I mean, you know, it's very straightforward.
Yes.
You're missing the point, buddy, if you're going to be going with just GDP.
Yes.
And I think that, yes, of course, we should criticize anything that's not perfect needs to be improved. But this is a pretty good direction to be going in.
Yeah.
So, you have any more time, Sarah?
Thank you so much. I mean, we do have many more questions, and I think we will have the questions shared with the moderator and the panelists. And I'm sure that you would be happy to answer the questions over the course of the next few days. There's a few really relevant questions, and actually about 12 questions actually that must be answered. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank Dr. Khosla, Shankar, Sarla for your time. Apologies again that Saurav Roy could not make it. And Dr. Khosla, I leave the last words to you to summarize, and thank you all very much on behalf of the Balipara Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to say two words. One is in summary. I think all of you heard what we said, and I don't want to have to repeat anything except that it was obvious that we're very deeply concerned, all panelists were very deeply concerned about the fact that ecological parameters, biodiversity-related and nature-related issues are inadequately being fed into the decision-making process, whether it's in businesses or in government or indeed in NGOs and most sectors of the economy. So that is, if you will pardon me, my summary. My plea, which comes out of that summary, is that in our country, and indeed almost everywhere around the world today, but we're only concerned about our country, the people who are concerned with these issues are also under threat. And the people who are concerned with these issues are largely what we call civil society, are largely NGOs, they're think tanks, they're media, they're academic research organizations. The civil society, which is all the sectors of the economy other than government and business, are at the moment not able to function in the best interest of the nation, because they've been really pretty massively emasculated by a variety of means. Thank God, and it's very unfortunate to have to say this, that this recent crises that have come up, COVID and then locusts and then cyclones and super cyclones coming from all sides, have woken up the government a bit and business that there is a need for civil society. We're being just recently, in the last 2 or 3 months, begun to be recognized as a significant and important player. So I just want to make a plea that we all have to now, the bulk of the people in this webinar are from that sector, and those who are not, I think, understand how important it is. But I think all of us are now owe it to the country that we try to make sure that there's a balance between the different sectors. You cannot just have the two-cylinder engine driving a nation. You really got to bring on board a very large number of other people. And I personally am involved very heavily, and so are people from Balipara Foundation and others, in trying to revive the standing, the position of civil society to be able to do the kinds of things we're doing here, which is try to keep a mirror to the government and business that they've got to behave well, which is to blow the whistle if they're not, which is to give them tools by which they can do better, like measure their performance. And these are not done internally by either of those sectors. So I just want to make very strong plea that you go away from here not only about the issues we've been talking about, but also the ramifications institutionally for India not to, if it were to lose the strong civil society that it has. So that is basically what I would like to leave you with. Thank you, Saurav.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Khosla, Shankar, and Sarla. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Saurav. Thank you, Ashok.
Thank you,
pleasure as always.
Thank you very much for
Sarla.
joining.
Thank you, Dr.
Hope
Khosla.
to see you all very soon. Thank you so much.